Now that you know you should plan your exit from day one, let's talk about your responsibility as an owner. The first thing you want to do is set what I call your owner initial exit goal. Don't worry, the goal can and will change as we move forward with your business, but let's take a look at a framework that helps you relate what your business can do into what you want as part of your own financial freedom. I start with something called a no work number. You take your desired annual income as if you were an employee at some company, you multiply it by 25. So if you want to make $100,000 per year, you multiply that times 25, and that equates to about a 4% return, which some people will use a larger return. I like to use a smaller return because of inflation and other types of reason. So that brings us to $2.5 million. In other words, if you had $2.5 million in the bank right now, at a 4% return, you'd be earning $100,000 per year. Next, add an amount for one-time savings. So you might have 6 months of income you like to put away. You might want to clear off some debts. You might want to put some money away for college funds, etc., etc. Add that on top. Next, you have to do what's called grossing up the number to get it for after tax. Because obviously, if we sold a business for $3 million, we wouldn't get to keep that. You take your effective tax rate, let's say you're in a 25% tax bracket, you 1 minus that, and then you divide by the lower number. So as you can see here, you take $3 million, you divide it by 0.75. That means that you need to sell a business for $4 million to pay a 25% tax to end up with $3 million to then have your no work number met. And here's the final and most important step. Often for many of you, when you're just starting out, you simply can't imagine a number that big. You haven't even released your first product yet. The key point is to now think about what's called your next step number. You don't have to run one Amazon or e-commerce business and run it until you get to your no work number. In fact, many people in the industry will build a company up, they'll exit that company, put some of the money away, maybe use a portion of it to go into a new brand, and then rinse and repeat. So let's say in this example that we want to use 25% of our no work number as our next step number. That gives us an initial exit goal of $1 million. Maybe that will feel, as you see through the program, still very large, but you'll actually find out that when you break it down into the number of successful products, that it's a reasonable goal that you could have. Okay. Now that you've got your initial exit goal, we have to confirm we have something called owner business market alignment. Here's what we mean. You first established your owner goal and your why. Now, we're establishing your goals on an economic basis, but of course your overall why might have other types of things, such as your purpose for helping your family. It might be to help a market niche that you really believe in, a number of other things. But from an exit strategy you really believe in, a number of other things. But from an exit strategy perspective, we're looking at the economic goal of the business. We then look to see whether or not the business supports that goal and does it align with it, and is the market that you're targeting the right size for your owner goals. Let's take a look at some examples where things are not aligned. The first one is, I've got an owner, and this was a real client of ours. All they wanted to do was generate enough after-tax profit to have $1 million in the bank. However, they had a number of good ideas, and so they were struggling because they were trying to get 3 different businesses going at one time. And each one of these businesses was in a competitive enough niche that could have generated at least a $2 million exit by focusing on just one of the niches. What we did is we said, you're overweighted and have too many businesses going for your owner. Do you see that lack of alignment? And so the recommendation was to realign the businesses to be consecutive, not concurrent. In other words, keep those other business ideas out there, and maybe you get to them, maybe you don't, but you're going to be far more focused and productive if you work on them one at a time. And most importantly, get your exit of your first business completed so that you know that you've achieved your owner goal. Another example. Someone wanted to generate enough after-tax profit to have $7 million in the bank so that they could have $280,000 a year and not have to work. They were in a 50-50 partnership. They were a very successful business, but it was a highly focused niche brand. We looked at it and we recognized that while the business was going great and the ownership structure was fine, the market opportunity was simply underweighted. They didn't have, even if they garnered a very, very high market share in the niche, it wouldn't have been enough for them when they multiplied it by 50% for them to reach their particular after work, after tax owner goal number. So we said to them, you really have three options. You either need to start a second brand, you maybe need to revisit the partnership with your 50-50 partner, you might even need to form a second business entity. But here's the key point. If you're not planning your exit from day one and looking at these criteria, you don't even know that you're in misalignment. And you might waste 2 or 3 years of your life before you recognize that you're never going to get to the goal that you really started the journey for in the first place. So once you get going and set your owner goal, then what you want to do is take a look at the business and the products that you're trying to release and see whether or not they align with what your owner goals are, and make sure that there's enough market opportunity to reach your owner goal. But on the flip side is if your owner goal is more modest, you don't have to go into one of the largest, most competitive markets out there in the industry and then feel like you're constantly trying to get to something bigger than what your owner goal really established that you need to do. It's this alignment that leads to success. Okay, from an action item standpoint then, write down your owner exit goal and then assess if your business that you're targeting and the market niches that you're targeting are aligned with this particular goal. Next up, we're going to talk about how e-commerce businesses are valued. I believe that the most important thing for you to understand when thinking about exiting is that your buyer of your business is your ultimate customer. So just like a customer, to understand your buyer, you must first learn how to speak their language. Think of this when you build out your products. You build out a product and you go and you list it on Amazon. You're thinking in the language of your customer in terms of what benefits that your product is going to provide them. Your buyer is exactly the same, except it just happens to be about your entire business. You want to think about the value of the business that you have and why that's relevant to a particular buyer. And frankly, if you don't do this from day one, you might be building something that doesn't make sense for a buyer. And as the famous Stephen Covey said, if the ladder's not leaning up against the right wall, every step you're taking is just getting you to the wrong place faster. Build your business to meet your ultimate customer will allow you to focus on one of the core aspects is that oftentimes what's good for selling a business is also what's good for running it. And it will help you eliminate what I call shiny object syndrome and getting very distracted on lots of other things because you'll be focused on building things that are truly valuable to you as a seller and also to your ultimate buyer. Before we can talk about what's really valuable, you might want a little bit of a backdrop on when we talk about an exit, what are we really selling in an Amazon-focused business? The first and most important thing you're selling is the future profit potential of the business. Businesses may be calculated on their historical profit, but they are valued based on the future potential of what that business is. In essence, think of it this way. If a buyer is going to buy your company on December 31st, they don't care what it did last year. They want to know what it can do on January 1st going forward, because that's the only profits that they're going to see. Next, you're also selling the inventory that has been built up in that particular business. If you think about a business that starts out, you might have very small inventory now, but by the time that you get going and maybe have 5 or 10 or 15 products out there, you may have built up hundreds of thousands of dollars in a hard asset called inventory that has value that the buyer is buying. And then finally, you're selling the intangible or other assets in the business. Things like your brand, your trademarks, your intellectual property, your listings on Amazon, and all of the reviews that you've built up, and in particular, the rating that you have established, and all of your different supplier relationships. So if you think about, before we talk about how to make this valuable, this really, and all of your different supplier relationships. So if you think about, before we talk about how to make this valuable, this really is, when you go to sell a business, the big three that you're selling. Okay. Now let's talk about, how do you value a business? I like to call it your 6 steps away from valuation on one page. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of these different 6 aspects, and we're going to start to take a look at how you can understand how e-commerce businesses are valued. Let's start with revenue. You take your gross revenue, you minus whatever you have to give away in discounts and returns. Let's say that's 3%, and that equals your net revenue. And in this example, I'm just using $100,000 a year business so that you can understand it. And importantly, the ratios alongside the right, the 3% and the 97%, will give you some idea of targets that you might want to think about, while also recognizing that every marketplace is different. But we've now established that you don't get to keep 100% of your revenue, because there will be these things called discounts and returns. Next up, you have to buy your products. So you have your product cost. Let's say that's 20%. You will have shipping, duties, and other types of storage costs, which may run, obviously depending on the size of the product, but could run 7% of the business. Then recognize you're going to have to pay the 15% Amazon selling fees, and you're going to have to pay a fulfillment fee for each unit that's shipped. That's based on a per unit cost, but the combination of those could easily be 35%. And if you take that and you subtract all of that away, your gross profit would be 35%. Next up is what's called your contribution margin. And the easiest way to think of the difference between gross profit and contribution margin is if you take your gross profit and you subtract off your marketing and other paid media expenses, you get to what's called your contribution margin. So as you can see here, we have another 8% in paid media, advertising costs, and another 2% in maybe giveaways or other types of promotional costs. That drops our contribution margin down to 25%. Then we look at all of the other expenses in the business for software and tools and other types of things. And let's say that those are 7%, and that equals a net operating profit of what's called 18% margin. However, there is this thing in the industry called add backs. And oftentimes there are certain things that you can add back into your business, such as your owner's salary, or maybe any other types of expenses that you might be running through the business as an owner that a buyer won't have. And we're not going to go into it in depth in this module, but I do want to let you know there is this thing out there called add backs. And when you get to add those back onto your net operating profit, as you can see here, you've got a 21% margin in the business. And I would submit to you that that's probably a realistic margin if you wanted to have a company that's valuable. You won't necessarily start out that way, but you certainly want to try and achieve a business that has 20% or better profitability. Finally, you take the profitability and you calculate the value based on the last 12 months using something called a multiple. And so for a business, multiples ranges from very low to very high. But for right now, let's just use the number 3. And if this business was doing $21,000 or $210,000 or whatever the number is, you multiply that times the 3, and that equals the valuation, which is the amount that a buyer would pay for that particular business. Here's the key point, is that you need to understand what makes a business valuable and then be able to see it all on one page. So there's not that many lines here that you could easily create a Google Sheet or a spreadsheet, and each month take a look at your numbers, have these categories, and start to understand, or work with an accounting or a bookkeeper to understand what the value of your business is, what the profitability is, and then use that last 12 months earnings multiple to motivate yourself, because you'll notice as your profitability goes up, your valuation goes up even faster. The other way that you should look at your profitability, this is covered in other modules, but I think is very important from a buyer perspective too, is to make sure that you look at the profitability on a contribution margin basis of each one of the products that you have out there. So there are plenty of tools and software and sheets that do that, but profitability is determined in two ways for a buyer. One is based on what's called your P&L, which I showed you on the slide before. The second is based on what's called your product contribution margins. So make sure you have the ability to track that as well. Now, the critical thing to understand is that how your buyer values a company is different than how they calculate the valuation. And let's talk about what I mean by that. When you look at all of the different things that are in your business in terms of taking over a business and making sure that it's valuable, these are all of the different types of things. You've got your profit margin here. You need to have strong profit margins. You need to have strong growth. You need to be diversified, which I like to say is don't have any one product worth more than 20% of your revenue. And recognize that the higher your earnings multiple will be driven by the larger your size. All of these things, these four core pillars, will lead to what's called a premium valuation. And then there's other types of things, such as how easy is it to take over your business? How strong is your brand? How many years have you been in business? Do you have any repeat purchases? All of these things contribute to the value of your business. So it's important for you to understand that how it's calculated is different than how it's valued. Here's the action item. Each month, track your core valuation metrics against a premium valuation. So look at your profit margin, look at your growth rate, look at your diversification, and track your earnings on that one page. Don't worry if the numbers don't look good right away. Trust me, they won't. Okay, but you need to build in the discipline to start tracking it right away at the beginning of your journey, because it will point you to knowing what your company is worth today. And then, as we'll see when we build a forecast, it will point you to what your company is worth tomorrow. Okay, let's take a look at a premium valuation company in more detail. You start with a premium valuation, and then what you do is you say, I want to make sure that I first focus on strong profit margins. Next, I want to focus on growth. Right there, you've got the two big drivers. So we went over it on the previous slide before, but if I had to break it down to two different things that are critical, it's these two. If you have better than 20% profit and better than 20% growth, you have a valuable business. Now, if you notice, the other slide before had a lot of different distractions to it. The two key things that you need to think about is, how do I release very profitable products, and how do I continue to grow by adding more and more products that meet this profit criteria? Then, and only then, start to think about the next criteria, which is the size of how big I get. Don't worry about doing too many things too fast. Oftentimes people try and release too many products too quickly when they don't know how to release them, and they lose their profitability. And then finally, take a look at the diversification. So the bottom part here is not as important as the top part. If you continue to focus on releasing profitable, growing products, the diversification of having 10 or 15 products out there and not having one product represent more than your success will naturally come over time. So what I'm trying to do is really get you focused on the things that will matter as you start your journey. Now notice all of the other things that come in. Having a strong brand, strong track record, recurring revenue, ease of taking over a business, all of those things, they are valuable. And in many ways, a strong brand will help you release profitable, growing products. But it's important for you to understand that without that, you will simply not get to your goal. Okay, now that we've broken out the chart that might be pretty confusing overall into its component parts, you can go back to the action item and say, okay, the first metric that I'm going to start tracking is I'm going to start tracking my profit margin on an accrual accounting basis each month for each one of my products and overall for my business. And second, I'm going to start looking at my year over year, that's what the Y over Y means, and my month over month growth rate. And in an e-commerce business, if you're only growing at 20% a year, that's considered flat. So the last point I'll make on this is that oftentimes when things don't look good, there's an inherent need to not want to track them. Don't get caught up in that. Even if your numbers start out very, very poorly, you need to track them because that's the guardrail that tells you whether your business is on track or not. There's an inherent need to not want to track them. Don't get caught up in that. Even if your numbers start out very, very poorly, you need to track them because that's the guardrail that tells you whether your business is on track or not.